Welcome to episode 2 of the Filmmaking Through Music podcast. My name is John Wader, and I am here on a mission to help you as a film director, videographer, producer, achieve a more narrative and compelling film through the effective use of original music. I'm here to make sure that music is not the one item of your film that falls through the cracks or falls by the wayside. I want you to be as adequately prepared as you can be as you're going to look to work with professional film composers. I want you to reach a wider audience. I want you to get into better festivals, and I want you to have a more commercially appealing film, and I want music to be a really key part of that. So thank you for being here. This is episode 2. Episode 1 was really the idea that started this whole podcast to begin with. It was about that initial conversation between a composer and a director, and the 3 key components that you really have to focus on in that first conversation, or just that first sort of beginning of the collaboration, right? So if you haven't started there or got to that episode yet, please do so, because it really lays the foundation for really the entire purpose of this podcast. But today we are going through knowing exactly what goes into the project itself of creating a film score, really understanding the process, the timeline, the key inputs and outputs that you're going to need to make sure that your composer is covering, or as a composer, make sure you're bringing these items to the table. I think it's really important as a director, you are the stakeholder, you are the quarterback. Everything on an independent project rolls up to you. And so, you need to best understand what your team is doing and what they need to accomplish so that you're able to give the right approvals and understand their expectations so you have the best timeline. And I want to bring out some of those things in this episode and really share a lot about experiences and share some experiences as well that I've had on films. I think ultimately following some of the steps or processes or framework that I cover in this podcast is what's going to allow you to have a more efficient post-production schedule. If music is part of that post-production, mostly part of that post-production schedule, this can certainly help build some efficiencies there and reduce some stress, hopefully. But I think some filmmakers are neglecting maybe the planning or the attention to detail that might go into the film score, and they just say, hey, you're the composer, you got this. That hands-off approach certainly can work. I'm sure it's worked for some, but I think it's very important for directors and filmmakers to be very involved in that process. Just because you're not a music person doesn't mean that you can't be super involved in the music itself. Directors direct more than just the actors and the set itself. They direct the direction of the music and the score. So you can almost, if a director isn't an actor, right, but they can still give direction to that actor of what they want them to do. The director is not necessarily a musician or a composer, but they can still give that direction to their composer. And I think that's a really key thing as a takeaway from this episode, because I think what I want to go into is all just about setting up the expectations for planning, for communication, for feedback, for revisions, and what that process looks like. Because I think if you don't know those or don't understand what has to go in there, you're going to have delayed production schedules. So, right, poor planning, poor communication, you're going to end up with missed deadlines, delays in overall production timeline, potentially impacting festival submissions or releases or promotional activities. Without clear communication and like a good feedback process, you end up with film music that is misaligned to your original vision. So vision was one of the main 3 things that we had talked about in episode 1. It was all about story, mood, vision, right? It was all about story, mood, tone, and vision of that project itself. So making sure you're setting up the proper communication channels is going to be the way that you kind of overcome, I think, a compromise and like artistic vision or misalignment there. Goes without being said as well, not understanding what goes in that process will also lead to misunderstandings, strained relationships, making future collaborations hard or difficult. Making future collaborations harder or more difficult. Right, and I think I've seen the successful indie films from Sundance and South by and those types of things. It goes back to that same analogy from episode 1 of filmmaking is the sum or product of all these many different parts. So if you're knocking it out of the park with your script and your acting and your writing, but you're not knocking it out of the park with the process and the output for your music and score, then it's going to bring the entire film down. Because ultimately, I think you as a filmmaker, you want to have the peace of mind and the trust. You want to have a good collaborative experience. You want to make sure that you want to trust that you are aligned in those expectations. And so again, I think just understanding that entire end-to-end process of what goes into the project itself of film composing and what good looks like, I think is super important. And honestly, as an editor, a film editor or a sound editor, I think it's very important to know these things as well. I share this visually with all directors I work with. So I walk them through I use like one of those cool whiteboarding tools like Figma. I walk them through what that timeline and process looks like, almost like a flow chart of like roles and responsibilities and what happens here and what happens here and how this goes to here. And then we loop back and things like that. And every time I share that with directors, I always ask if someone has shared that with them before, and they always say no. I think it's really important to level set, understand expectations, because you're hiring a composer or you're being hired as a composer. So the person that's hiring you needs to know what the level of effort this is going to take and what your role is and what their role is as well. But let's start with like project startup, project initiation. So again, going back to episode 1, you start with those initial conversations. So it's always about story, mood, tone, and vision. And that's something that can happen just from those initial calls, even when you're still kind of figuring out if you want to work together. But the goals there as a director are to educate the potential composer on the project. That's explain the emotional goals, explain the project goals, and those types of things. And as a composer, right, they're trying to like listen and understand and empathize with what is going on. So again, story, tone, mood, vision there, but also inspiration and reference. I know that you as a filmmaker, you have your shot deck, you have your studio binder or your Milanote or just your PowerPoint slides, whatever you have. I know that you have a collection of inspirational stills or clips and those types of things. Those are very useful to share with your composer. All filmmakers share that with their DP and their colorists and whatnot and their editors, but that impacts your composer as well. It's understanding that the composer is part of that filmmaking team. So if there is something that is impacting anyone on that core filmmaking team, your composer is absolutely part of that as well. Early on, I think you can start early on once you cover those particular mood, tone, story, vision, inspiration, references. Then you can start getting to like what I call score styles, and that's a sometimes challenging conversation because I'm very big on, as a filmmaker, you do not need to understand the musical language. Right? It's our jobs as composers to translate filmmaking in musical language. The only question that you need to answer is this piece of music working for the scene? The end. The answer is either yes or the answer is no. If it's no, well, what's not working? The answer to that question of if it's not working should never have to be, oh, well, this one instrument is distracting me, or I don't know what that sound is, but I don't like that one sound. It should be focused on, well, I know we wanted something, uplifting, but this feels a little too uplifting. This feels a little bit too much like the end of the movie when they win everything, right? Something in between. So the score style conversation can start to get a little bit musical, but I think it's really important to just share inspiration. So it goes back to inspiration, likes and dislikes. You're a filmmaker, so I know that I know you can think of movies where you have enjoyed the score or you haven't enjoyed the score or certain types. So again, it's part of the process, but as a director, it's not your job to have a point of view on that. You should be looking for a composer that's able to present a point of view and their professional recommendation based on their industry experience of what might work here. Okay, this is a science fiction story. Okay, we know what might work for that kind of story. Or we might say, hey, here are some common ideas for sci-fi scores. Is that where you want to go? Or do you want to go something way off book? Something totally different. So those are the kind of conversations you can have more about what do you want to do with your score? Do you want to go on the nose? It's a Western, you're doing a Western score. It's a nostalgic 80s coming of age. Are we going to go for the nostalgic 80s type synth music that we all love? So those are early conversations, but your composer is there to provide a point of view and a professional recommendation. However, they are also there to follow your leadership and your guidance. The film composer is creating music. They are hired to do the job and to serve the story through music. And so if you're the director and you're saying, hey, it's an 80s coming of age throwback, but I don't want that kind of music, the composer's there to kind of talk it back and forth, but ultimately they're there to serve your vision. So when you do have ideas that you want for a film score and that you are passionate about, you definitely balance that conversation with your composer of, hey, this is what I want. This is what we're going for. This is the vision. This is the goal. I understand that your professional experience might tell you otherwise, but that goes back to just what I was saying just a few minutes ago about the importance of aligning expectations and communication plans. So then that's probably around the time that you've decided that you are good to work together, right? We'll have episodes in the future about contracts and agreements and rights and things like that, because once again, on independent projects, when you're often going right to the director or the producer for that agreement, There are probably words, phrases, terms in there that are new to the director or production team. So I think, down the road, we'll talk about just sort of like what a good composer agreement looks like. But let's just say at this point, you've gotten past that. So now what's the next part of the process? We're kind of where the negotiation and contract phase is kind of a spin-off of that sort of end-to-end process. But now we're kind of getting the setup. And the first thing I do on all my projects is really go through like an onboarding and project initiation process. The first thing that I do on every project once we're signed is just go through that sort of onboarding process and experience. And this is all, again, where you can really start focusing on your actual timeline, your milestones, and your communication plans. And so what I do on every one of my projects is I actually bring you into my Slack workspace. So I try to get off email as much as possible. We all email way too much, especially, and email is especially rough when you're constantly dealing with video files and audio files, and it just gets confusing and it adds up. And if you try using like the comments in Google, that can get kind of messy as well. And then also when you're emailing, you start saying things like, "Hello, director. I hope this email finds you well. Attached, please find," right? And then the director reply says, "Hello, John. Thank you so much for sending this cue. I have some thoughts on the feedback for this. Here, and it just gets we don't speak like that." And I've learned that because this is a business of relationships, right? And because I keep going back to communication and alignment of expectations, I just learned that obviously being in person is great. So I love having directors in person to watch stuff live or even tweak things live. That's obviously the best. I use Slack just because we can talk just like we're talking normally. It's basically like texting, but with Slack or any of those other communication tools, I can have bookmark links. I can have notifications come in and out of there. I can set up automations from different software I'm using to get put in there. We can bring people in easily. We can bring in a sound editor into that Slack channel, and they can see all the history. Slack kind of serves as the home page for communication, but also the home page for anything, for trackers, for references, right? So I have that all set up for my projects, and it just really allows us to communicate with plain language quickly and not have to worry about losing things over email. And now the reason that I want to bring in sound editors and sound designers or picture editors into my Slack workspace. Now, also, I might join if the production has a Slack workspace or a Discord workspace, I might join that as well. But I love getting everybody involved in that post-production so that I don't overwrite music. That's something that the sound designer or the sound editor is working on. I want to make sure that I understand what's going on with the editor and the director so that there might be some huge picture edits coming up in the next week or two, I'm not going to work on music for those scenes because I know that I'm going to have to change it anyways. Filmmaking is a collaborative experience, and we have a lot of people giving input to a lot of different areas. And obviously the director, it's a director and composer thing for the score, but I've been on a number of projects where maybe producers are giving a little bit more feedback, and that's totally fine, right? It's totally dependent on the project itself. So just another reason to kind of get everybody involved in a central place to communicate, but also a central place for tracking. And so I mentioned that I use Slack because I can put because I can put bookmarks there and I can put links there, and then anybody can join in and out and have access to that. And it's clean and it's simplified. But I use very meticulous project management tracking for all my scores as well. And there are a number of good sort of like Google Sheet templates out there, and there is some software out there to help with this as well. But I've found that using a modern professional project management software works best for this because these tools and these softwares are created to manage any sort of work, any sort of project. Doesn't matter what the workflow is because they're so highly customizable. So I use ClickUp. And I have a custom workflow and workspace in there specifically for film projects. And I have automation built in that kind of auto creates projects when I have contracts signed and those types of things. But I have things set up in there, and I have automation set up in there that when I add a new Dropbox link, because it's a new picture version, it automatically updates the status to under review, because now I know that needs to go to a director for review. And I really love doing that because my directors and my filmmaking teams basically get a dashboard, a real-time dashboard where 24 hours a day they can go there and they can see the exact status, and it's not like they have to worry about me updating a spreadsheet or those types of things. And again, that's just an example of, I think, the level of detail that needs to be brought on to the film composing projects. So I really love getting that set up there. As part of that, right, and as part of that agreement as well, is where you'll set up those milestones and target dates. This is a conversation that I have with every director, really from almost the first conversation. It's just understanding timeline. And so what I do is once I get an idea of what their overall goals are, what their production timeline and festival deadlines, is when I say, okay, here are the sort of key composing deadlines that we'll need. And because that really helps understand and break down the level of effort that goes in there. And so the first part is what I call providing a sound palette design and sketching. Now, without getting super technical into the music, that's where I try to explain, hey, I'm just gonna make you a paint palette, the old Bob Ross paint palette. I'm gonna put some colors on there, and I'm gonna show those to you and say, hey, are these the right colors that we should be working with, right? I'm doing that with music. Is this where we're at? Are we playing in the right ballpark? Is this just kind of the idea of where we wanna go? Because that'll help us set up for the future of the rest of the score. And again, another episode, we'll get into kind of what that sound palette and consistency looks like. But I wanna make a commitment to you of when I can get those first initial ideas to you, almost like an audition of sorts. You could almost consider that like an audition if that was in play here. So that's kind of the first milestone or date that I will give to directors. And second is really the date of sort of the next part of the film composing process, and that's the spotting session. The spotting session is something that typically the composer, director, producer, whoever might be involved, will come together and watch the film without music and make decisions on where music should go. Whether that's licensed music, so a music supervisor could be there as well, if applicable, but where music should and shouldn't go. Now, many directors will have a point of view of where they want that to happen, as will the composers, but it's a collaborative effort of saying, hey, we should really put something here, but not here because it conflicts with here. Oh, that's a great piece for licensed music. Okay, let's definitely get score there. Hey, this is where one theme can go, this is where one theme can go. And it really just helps the team set up expectations of how much music might need to get done, because that'll end up telling us, hey, we have this much music to get done, we need to be done by this date. Okay, how do we make that fit there? So you're really kind of starting with the end goal in mind, which is very important. And again, it really helps set up those communication and expectations. I can't say that enough of how important it is to set up those expectations early on, because from day one, my director knows exactly what I'm going to be working on. And then that gets more in, and then I'll get, again, so many ideas for this podcast. We'll get into more of the project management piece as well, sort of about reviewing and feedback and those types of things, and how to communicate those best. Okay, the third date that I commit to for every project is just initial cues submitted for feedback. That's the first review session. Most of the time, it's just usually, I would say it's anywhere from maybe 5 to 10 minutes of music. Maybe that's 2, 3, or 4 different cues. Just, all right, here we go. It's kind of an extension of sort of that sound palette discussion, but that's really the first review meeting. It's kind of the output of that, just to really start continuing on the process. So I think it's important to get that out of the way early on. And as a director, you do not want to wait super long to be getting that first level of feedback to your composer. You have to leave an adequate amount of time to let them get composing, of course, but early and often is definitely good for feedback. So it's kind of 3 and 4. Milestone 3 is submitting the first cues, and milestone 4 is the target date for that first feedback meeting. And then it just goes kind of a cycle from there. When I share my film composer process overview in Figma with directors, I have scoring revisions kind of on a loop there. There's a timeline, but then scoring and revisions can go back and forth because we're working until we get approvals. And then somewhere in there could also be what's called conforming, which would mean we have a piece of music that we like that might be approved, but the picture has changed. In the middle of the scene, 3 seconds have now been removed. Now that piece of music just doesn't fit. And so we don't need to rewrite the music or revise the music, but we just need to edit it or conform it to fit the updated picture. And then once we have approvals for each of those cues, we'll get into, if applicable, kind of like preparation for live recording. I won't get into that too much in this episode, but we don't record live typically until we have those pieces of music approved, and that recording preparation could take some time. You might know that you're going to live record because you have the budget for it, so you're booking sessions well in advance, but there's always a little extra timeline if you are planning on doing any sort of live recording, because there's a lot of other people that have to hire and get involved in that process. Now, another thing to always incorporate time for, whether you're doing live recording or not with your film composer, is allocating time for professional mixing of that score, right? And not to go into the technical details there, but chances are your film composer is probably going to do that themselves, unless you have the budget for it, of course, for a dedicated score mixer. And then, of course, the ultimate milestone at number 7 there, the 7th date, is, of course, the delivery date, and that's the main one. And so that's always the one that's on top of my mind. I want to wrap up this episode by just quickly revisiting the benefits of why I think it's so important for filmmakers to understand that end-to-end scoring process, because this is a process that your professional filmmakers understand. Your award winners at Sundance and South by and those types of things, they understand the need for strong communication and collaboration in that film scoring process, and that alignment of expectations of what you need there. And I think if you're reviewing this episode and you're breaking down all the elements and all the phases, right, the step by step, right, all the elements and all the phases, if you're hitting on those, right, you're going to entrust that you're going to have the right film score. You don't need to worry about, oh, is this going to work? Oh, do we have enough time, right? Because you've taken the time to set up communication, set up expectations and collaboration, and make sure you have good ways of working with that composer. So again, you can have peace of mind and trust that you are going to have a film score created for your film that emotionally serves the narrative and is really going to help elevate your film to a more complete and professional level. I go through quite a bit in detail on the film scoring process in my film scoring guide for directors. Again, you can click the link to get that playbook in the show notes here, and it'll be sent to you. And it's a interactive website that kind of goes through a lot of the components that I'm covering in these first early podcast episodes. Thanks so much. Happy filmmaking.